Hey, Mr. Mike here with Chapter 4 of the book Resilient. Radical Love. Radical love could have saved Nikolas Cruz, the Parkland shooter. Chapter 4 is the fourth chapter explaining the why of the book Resilient. And I really need you to see the church of 2050. And these first four chapters explain the why I need you to see the church of 2050. Now forgive me, but from here on out, when I finish the next sentence, I'm going to be relaying this testimony and speaking as if I was the author for maximum impact. And every time you hear the name of the organization Awana, I want you to insert Breezewood Church. Because if God could do it for Awana then, He can do it for Breezewood now. It was February 17th, 2018, 3 days after a most horrific school shooting in Parkland, Florida. They had just lost 17 of their children, and 2 days later I found myself being interviewed by a Christian radio program broadcasting in South Florida, including Parkland, where the shootings had taken place. The radio host just asked a question, and I was feeling brokenhearted and compelled to speak of something beyond the ceaseless, as of yet unresolvable debate on gun control, or the probable causes for someone to behave so ruthlessly that the usual typical media covering of school shootings covered. And I found myself reaching into my heart to search for some words of hope, some insight that would comfort, something that could shed some light and possibly stop the carnage. Where were the words that had God's perspective? And without premeditation, I suddenly found myself saying, radical love could have saved Nikolas Cruz, the Parkland shooter. And even as I said it, I realized it might sound like a simple overstatement to many people, including some Christ followers. Could radical love have broken through to a disturbed 19-year-old who was gun-obsessed and angry at the world enough to kill 17 kids his age and wound 17 others? Could radical love have performed an early intervention and walked through his life's challenges with him so that he was not alone? Could radical love have changed the trajectory of this tragic story in life? In the days that followed, other radio stations, other print media picked up my remarks that radical love could have saved Nikolas Cruz. And when I heard that phrase with my name attached, I repeatedly asked myself, did I really believe that? And each time, my conviction grew stronger, and my heart echoed back, yes, I believe it. Radical love could have saved the Parkland shooter from targeting his pain and suffering into the world until 17 innocent classmates lay dead at his feet. The national debate on gun control is a stuck needle and impotent. Looking into our government for hope for solutions that will protect our children is already too little, too late. Mental health experts weigh in, but in the end, nothing much seems to be reversing the cycle of violence. Debate falls short. But even as the news of radicalized by hatred students rampaging through their campuses seems to be a nightmare we can't wake up from, we cannot give up hope. The hope for a culture is found in the way of Jesus, the living out of the redemptive work of the gospel. But, and this is a huge but, we must remember how to love radically. What does radical love look like in our church today? That's what the radio interviewer asked me. It starts with kids. Really. When we love a community's children, we will have more influence and more church growth than we can handle. we may also heal a child who is on his or her way to pumping the world with his or her pain from the trigger of a rifle. Radical love is salvation. It's redemption. It's repurpose. It's redirection. It's accompaniment and championing. It is the beauty of the gospel alive through the church. Radical love opens doors. Radical love is the kind that opens church doors to every child within its reach. And that means the kids with behavior problems. That means children from dysfunctional and hard to work with homes. The children of poverty. Children who are already social outcasts. Children with special needs. Children of different nationalities and tongues. The others. The different. The quirky. The hard. The left out. The overlooked. The abused. The neglected. The hungry. The lonely. The bullied. The ones already sliding into despair. The exploited. The trafficked. The immigrant. When Jesus said, "Let the children come," I'm pretty sure that he wasn't thinking only about bring your church kids whose lives are supported by believing and loving homes. No, his words were also meant to carry those other kids through our church doors and into our hearts. Our legitimate concerns with retention studies that indicate we're losing our own kids has had us focused on only one part of the child world, our kids. But what about the others? When a church throws open its doors and lets the children come, it changes everything. I'm touched by the kind of love these let the children come churches give to kids. Radical love looks a lot like Oakwood Baptist Church in New Braunfels, Texas. This church started Awana only recently, and not long after I ran into the senior pastor, Ray Still, and their executive pastor, Rusty Rice. And these two pastors were eager to tell me what their first year of partnering with Awana had been like. Ray says, "We thought we might have 100 kids come, but instead, a couple hundred more are showing up. This abundance of children forced them to make some choices. Go normal or go radical. Should they cut off the number of kids that were allowed to come? Should they restrict it to their own church kids?" Sadly, that is often the difficult decision that churches are forced to make. But no, they didn't go normal. They didn't go easy. They went radical. That meant finding twice the number of adults to help out. Everyone on paid staff, from the lead pastor on down through the ranks, had to show up to register kids, lead small groups, organize games, listen to verses, lead large group times. But these men were smiling as they told me about their situation. They were excited to share the news of their abundance of children. Yes, we all showed up. It was crazy, but it was also exciting. So we decided, why not? Let's go all out and feed them pizza on Awana night. But there was more. Pastor Ray wanted to talk about a special kid in his small group of 9 grade school boys. I have this one kid in my group who is a nightmare. He said it's still smiling. He is a full-time job for me almost every week. And recently I met his mother and I said, "I would like to talk to you about your son." And I saw her face drop. She prepared herself for the all too familiar bad news. And he continued, "I told her we love having your boy at our church. He is always welcome here, and we are doing just great." Ray paused to let his emotions pass. I saw her face light up. She had steeled herself for the usual bad report. I could see how surprised she was that finally there was a word of encouragement coming from somewhere in the world about her child. A couple of hours a week in the presence of a caring adult who show God's radical love to their community, to each and every child, can change everything. Even chance encounters can carry the power to change lives. Here's to the radical love of a pastor who gets out of the pulpit once a week to sit at a kid-sized table to love and disciple kids from his community. I know this may sound radical to our Awana community, but Wes Stafford, President Emeritus of Compassion International and the current Awana board member, explained it this way. Sometimes the most important thing that could fill in the blanks of a child's handbook is not that they successfully memorize Scripture that week, but something that says, "You are a great kid. God loves you, and we are so glad you are here." That's what radical love looks like. It's not something you get from having the right curriculum or a program. It is a heart for God that puts kids first. We are loved into loving Jesus. Let me say that again. We are loved into loving Jesus. And who knows what each of us is capable of without the redeeming work of God in our lives. We are saved from our sin, and we are safe from what we might have become. Of all people, we know the power of God unto salvation, the reality of changed and freed lives, the impact of radical love. When the current leadership team at Awana was forming, we decided to share our childhood stories with each other. One by one, the childhood pain unfolded as we trusted each other with our most vulnerable selves. One remembered the night that his father rampaged through their home, packing up to leave his family forever. And while his older brother shielded him with his body and was reading a book really loud to distract him from the adult, potentially violent scene that was unfolding, another shared how he was beaten by his mother every morning before school for wetting the bed as a child. She would wait until everyone else had left for the morning, and then when they were home alone together, she would beat him every morning. No one knew this shameful secret of his mother's behavior. A writer shared what he had written for his father's funeral. A man who was a Vietnam veteran, an angry and abusive father. I wondered as we listened, how do you sum up the life of a man who broke you as a child? Do you still call him father? One after another, the painful truths were told, and we shared our brokenness, and we took off our masks that made us appear beautiful and untouched, and we showed each other our scars. We showed what was done to us behind closed doors. We grieved that those who should have loved us rejected us and left us with the imprint of adult sin on our lives. We grieved for each other, but we shared more than our brokenness. And interestingly, a pattern of another kind was emerging from our stories. We all shared something else in common. All of our stories ended with the phrase, "But there was a church." I was my mother's whipping boy, but there was a church who loved me. No one knew how dysfunctional we were and how abused and humiliated I was at home, but there was a church where people fathered and mothered me. My dad abandoned my mother and he just walked out of our lives, but there was a church, and they took my mom and me in to its heart. We all had a knowing past, but we had more. In all our lives, there was a church that made all the difference. And in that sacred place, we had found radical love. We belonged. That's why we believe without reservation that faithful churches can love in a way that can make all the differences for the Nicholas Cruzes and all the us too children. We never know how desperate a child's need might be, or what they might be experiencing at an adult's hands, or why their child has come into our lives or into our church at this time. But we can be sure of this. If they are there, God is doing a work in their lives, and we are part of their story. Maybe they will lead an international discipleship ministry to children when they grow up. Maybe God will use their knowing past. When I'm working on the West Coast, I occasionally attend Calvary Church in Westlake Village, California, where my friend Sean Thornton pastors. This is a beautiful and affluent church set in coastal hills. One Sunday I made a surprise visit, and I thought that afterward I would stand in line to say hi and greet Sean. But I had a long and interesting wait. How can I say this? The people who reached Sean ahead of me were children with disabilities, adults in wheelchairs, and others who struggled to speak clearly or express their thoughts. I smiled as I realized that as successful as Pastor Sean is, these are his special people. The pieces of just who Sean is came together for me that morning. I had previously read his book about his childhood called All But Normal, where he described life at home with a mother who was suffering from traumatic brain injury, and the trauma of living with a mother who is often in fits of rage, and is dangerous. And one night in particular was etched in his memory. It had been a night of hell like no other in our house. "I'm tired of this. I'm not living like this anymore. I'm going to divorce you," Mom shrieked. "Go ahead," Dad yelled back. "What do I care?" Most of these battles died out after a little while, but 30 minutes later this one was still going strong. And from across the room, Mom grabbed something and threw it at Dad, hitting the cabinets near his head, and in anger, Dad rolled around and he threw something back to warn her not to do it again. "Boys, go to your rooms," Dad said. Troy and I didn't hesitate. We wanted out of there as much as they wanted us gone. The raging went on for hours. Walls pummeled with unseen objects, accusations of the most penetrating kind, wielded like daggers. I heard the front door opening, and out my window I saw something that wrenched my heart apart. My mother, her body so stiff she could barely walk, and her breath coming out in angry huffs. And that was the night my mother was taken to the mental ward. But no one at church realized the trouble that they were in at home. Still, church was our safe place. And today, that same Sean is a pastor with a knowing past. It's why every Sunday he stands and receives stories and comments from anyone who is in need. And he needs his time. He gives them that time. It's why he does it week after week. It's how God uses his knowing past. Sean explains it like this. Before taking the pulpit on Sundays, I often find myself imagining who will be sitting in the congregation that day and what they are struggling with. I visualize the wealthy people who had family members held captive by alcohol or drugs. I pictured poor people who just heard they had cancer and have no way of paying for treatment. I thought of grandparents whose grandkids don't visit anymore. Men who had just lost their jobs. Kids who were lonely. Hundreds of scenarios played out through my head, and I felt the pain of each one of them, and I realized our family possessed something in our little house on Victory Road that many people simply didn't have. The love and the purpose of God in the midst of seeming chaos. No matter how bad or broken life seemed, God met us with hope. This insight that this gave me into people's lives was like a sixth sense. Somehow in the context of craziness and pain, God had given me a pastor's heart. A sixth sense. That's radical love, born of a knowing past. We may never know their whole stories, but this we know. We are the church, His body, His light, in an increasingly dark world, we have not only the advantage of a knowing past, but we have a way to love with a radical love that belongs to Christ's followers alone. And it starts with children. Albert Mohler, president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, asked some hard questions when it comes to the kind of love that the church is offering kids today. What are we doing or not doing with the kids that we have? I think the answer to that is direct and straightforward. We have surrendered Sunday school and youth ministry in many of our churches, and I am the product of being involved in a local church many hours a week as a boy and as a teenager. My frame of reality was largely set by my parents' design, and it was be at church whenever the church offered an opportunity. And there were many opportunities. We had Sunday school, youth choir, royal ambassadors for boys, ACT teams for girls. There were weekly youth fellowships, youth meetings, regular retreats that were wonderful, and faithful adult volunteers, as well as a faithful youth minister. Christian Smith and his research associates found that one of the distinguishing marks of young people who continue in church participation as adults was that they had developed a warm and trusting relationship with an adult in the church, even just one, other than their own parents. Radical love was once normative for the church, but today radical love is too often the exception. Radical love goes beyond what's expected to a whole life, defining way of relating to a generation of kids. It's so much more than just volunteering. Radical love might move you beyond volunteerism and cause you to become a child champion. I mean, you speak up for the value of children in your church. You raise the bar for the importance of volunteering that is faithful, dependable, and passionate for kids. Radical love might move you beyond child championing to becoming a generational guardian. Someone who is there for kids through their childhood, through their young adulthood, and every step of the journey. You walk the walk throughout your lifetimes together. Radical love might make your church the kid-friendliest church in town. You might just end up with everyone's kids. You are the ones who can make the greatest investment and difference. Yes. In our organization, when we ask churches that are leaving Awana in their exit polls, why are you leaving? More than anything else, they say, not enough volunteers. So we're moving everything to 1 hour on Sunday. We need something that's easier. So sad. At a time when the church needs to be exerting greater effort into ensuring the future of faith by the discipling of kids, some have become discouraged. Some have given up. Some have grown apathetic about their own futures and their children's futures. I check my heart. Yes, I believe radical love could have saved Nicholas Cruz. And I believe something else as well. Radical love could be the fearless future of faith. Okay, this is Mr. Mike again, no longer speaking as the author, and I challenge you to have a heart-to-heart with any or all the other children's leaders. And I think you will find that not one of us came from a perfect home. I think you will also find that all of us were impacted by someone other than our parents, and that love helped alter the course of our life. I mean, come on, Breezewood. If you have a pulse, we really need you, and all the passion that you can muster. How about it? Are you ready for some radical love? Here's some essential questions. Do you believe radical church love could be the solution to our country's epidemic of gun violence? Why? or why not? List the ways that the church could extend radical love to a community. To whom does the church need to extend radical love? What people groups do we need to love more radically as Jesus himself would? What groups think that they are beyond Christian love? How can we examine our hearts and make adjustments and change our culture's perception about the limits of Jesus' love? Join me at the next Leaders Session to discuss our answers. May God's peace and mercy be on you and your family.